This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known publisher on the web, a prolific web publisher, and also the publisher of UpToMinds.com. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Gordon. Glad to be here again.
Well, Happy New Year, and I hope you had a great holiday, and may 2015 be a prosperous year for you.
Thank you very much, and same back at you.
Did you make any New Year's resolutions that are still valid?
My main one is work less. You know, I'm like you, at the age where we're supposed to be semi-retired and we're working harder and longer hours than we did when we had our so-called core career.
Yeah, I am retired, and but my wife says not. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. I enjoy our discussions every month. We've been doing them a couple years now, and I need to mention to our listeners, these are not interviews. This is a discussion that we have on whatever subject you and I decide we're going to talk about. We just happen to tape it and put it out in the public domain. And the thing I wanted to talk about today, Charles, is what I think and you think the big theme is going to be in 2015, and that is deflation, the Achilles heel, really, of this whole Fed policy. Of what you and I have talked about of monetary malpractice. But you've written 4 articles that kind of touched on it this month, which prompted me to bring the subject up. But you define deflation, and you defined it differently than I've heard anybody define it before. And I have it up here. Could you explain it to everybody? Okay.
The definition is any increase in the purchasing power of nominal wages is deflation. And let's kind of walk through that. The conventional description of inflation and deflation is if the money supply is expanding, you get inflation. And if the money supply is contracting or shrinking, you get deflation. But this is not actually how the world works, because Japan's been printing money for 20 years and they still have deflation. So clearly that's the money supply is not the only mechanism that's at work in deflation. And so the way I define deflation is if your wages are purchasing more goods and services, then that's deflationary. And if they're purchasing less, if you're getting less for your money, that's inflation. And so the reason why this matters is in a globalized economy, when we get cheaper goods from like China or another exporting nation, and our money goes further, buys more goods than it did before, that's deflationary. And when technology advances, and you're an old technologist and engineer, so you can speak to just how deflationary technology is. You know, like the tools that we can buy now for a few $100s used to cost tens of thousands. That's enormously deflationary. So that's something that we need to connect to this inflationary policy of the Fed and the other central banks. They're printing money, they're trying to create inflation, and yet we're getting deflation. Like, how is that possible? And so one thing that people don't often explain is that if you and I have a business and money is cheap and abundant, we can borrow money for almost nothing, and well, then we'll go buy 10 robots and lay off our workers, right? We can then lower our production costs. That's deflationary because our customers are getting the same product for less money. But we've also lowered the pool of wages, so there's less demand. So then you get a supply-demand cycle where there's more and more supply from overcapacity and less demand because there's fewer people making enough money to buy the stuff. So that actually, when you create that cycle, the engine of that cycle is free, abundant liquidity, free credit from the central banks, because that allows us to create overcapacity and replace our workers with cheap robots and software.
I wrote, Charles, a full thesis paper here a year and a half ago called the Globalization Trap, and then I argued exactly that point. And what's happened is the demand globally, I believe at that time, was already slowing down, and it has subsequently really started to show more recently the degree of which the slowing is coming down, because as you pumped out more inflation, real disposable income, wages are not growing at a fast enough rate relative to the real inflation of what people put in their basket of goods. And as that takes hold, all of a sudden demand growth relatively isn't growing. So demand starts to weaken, and that's what's happened globally. The United States is a 70% consumption economy. We have been the engine of growth around the world as we've spent with reckless abandon to a 70% level. But with jobs and with real disposable shrinking, that is pulling the rug out from under this artificial growth. And as you put more money out there, as you pointed out, all you're doing is you effectively pull demand forward. So you buy more time, but eventually you've got overcapacity, lack of demand, and things start to show up. And that's what's happening. Commodities have been falling for quite some time. Just now we've seen it in oil. We've seen it in the spreads on credits. We've seen the yield curves flattening dramatically for quite some time. These have been very, very evident. Forward inflation expectations have been there. So the expectation of deflation really arriving has been pretty evident for some time.
Yeah, and Gordon, you have several roadmaps here: the globalization trap and the monetary malpractice, and the value of those is, I think, that it shows that the central banks have printed money and printed distributed credit, made it very cheap and easy to borrow money, with the hope that businesses would expand production but hire more people and create more demand, right? That's how you get inflation. You can't just create more supply. You've got to create more demand.
Charles, that's the storyboard for printing more money.
Right.
That's what it's supposed to result in.
Right.
I don't believe for one moment is that really the reason. The real reason for printing and expanding the credit is to finance the debt that we have so excessively in the developed world, and to rebalance, because deflation is good for consumer, is good for the citizen, it's good for savers, it's good for pensioners, it's good for the people to have deflation, as you point out, productivity, etc. It's not good for those who have leveraged loans, governments that have large amounts of debt. They want inflation because it allows them to pay it off in less value, or reduce purchasing power of those who have the wealth, because wealth is really purchasing power, and so they're eroding our purchasing power to debase the currency. So that's what it's about. It's about funding the size of the debt. If we really believed it was going to get growth, which it does in the short term, for a shorter period of time, if we were going to do it for 18 months at maximum, I would buy into that. How long have we had zero interest rate policy? And by the way, how long did Japan have it? At what point do you say you brought so much demand forward that you've got a black hole? I don't mean to exaggerate, but this is not complicated.
Right. No, you're absolutely right, Gordon, and it's good that we need to break apart those two elements of the story. The official public story is we're trying to create inflation because that's going to help create more wages and jobs and blah, blah, blah. That's obviously failed. And I think one of the elements people don't talk about is, why has it failed? Why doesn't Japan have 10% inflation instead of deflation after 20 years of quantitative easing? Well, it's... as you say, you bring demand forward, and so there's a demand shortage in Japan as a result, but it's also, where does the money go? And when you print money from the central bank, where does it go? Well, it goes into asset bubbles. It doesn't go into wages. That's where the storyboard has really failed. If you and I are running a business, it only makes sense for us to replace expensive human labor with cheap capital robots and software, because the money is so cheap. We might as well invest our money in reducing our production costs. And
which is what happened. But what's happened now too is that we've had such great gains in productivity that we've now got to the point where we've laid off so many people that the demand has shrunk because the productivity of automation has left so many people without jobs. We haven't come along with the new technologies, the new innovations that create new industries. There's no new investment, so that the corporations today, Charles, are not investing anymore in new ideas at a significant rate. Last quarter, 90% of all of the profits of the S&P went into buybacks of their shares and dividends. Where's the investment? So they're not even investing in the new technology, the new rate, ever mind creating the jobs. We've reached that stage. That's the point I'm saying. If you go on too long, you reach this whole financialization, which then it's just moving paper, effectively, what we end up doing.
That's right. And as you described,
not as opposed to productivity, and right. As opposed to capital investment.
Right. We're not investing in productivity and wealth creation. We're investing in bubbles. As you say, what happens when you buy back most of your stock or a big part of your stock with borrowed money? Well, then your stock goes crazy. And so that's how we get asset bubbles. And the same with real estate. If I can borrow money at 1% and buy a house that yields 5% in rent, I'm crazy not to, because I have no other way to get a yield. So then you get bubbles in every asset class.
Charles, we have, in my mind, and a friend of mine, Ronnie Stoffel, refers to it as monetary tectonics. And that is, we've got these two plates, one of inflation and one of deflation. I'm talking globally now. I'm not talking about within a country specifically. And that is, in the developed world, we have deflation. The developed world being Europe, the EU, Bank of England, the United States, and Japan. All the biggest debtors in the world, and we're printing or expanding the monetary base to offset it. We're trying to fight, quote, inflation, but we've really got deflation. If you go to the other side of the plate, around the emerging markets around the world, if you go to Brazil, Latin America, China, except the inflation is their problem. They've got significant, in some cases, very serious inflation. And really, it's about hot money. So as we print the money, and let's pick on the United States here, that since we went to 2008 and zero interest, etc., we've had nearly $9 trillion of money that did not go back to Main Street, did not go into productivity improvements. It left the country and ended up in the emerging markets and around the world. And that fostered a lot of development, which was demand, supply, and then we brought the supply forward. But now what's happened is they borrowed all this money in U.S. dollars, and suddenly the U.S. dollar is strengthening, and they're on the wrong side of the borrowing. So they're going to have to pay it back in bigger dollars. So they're having to cover right now. And we've got this massive short squeeze, which is driving the dollar even up stronger. The problem, therefore, Charles, is all the profits of the S&P companies are in U.S. dollars that are being repatriated, and earnings have been taken down 30% in the last 60 days. This bubble mentality ends and can end very, very badly.
Well, that's a point that you have a slide here, Gordon, which you titled "The End Game," and
yes.
What I think it's perfect time for you to just go through how that dynamic you just described ends up collapsing collateral and all the leverage that's been piled on that collateral.
Yeah, when we did the globalization trap, the conclusion we came to was that it wasn't a matter of whether we're going to have deflation or inflation within countries and globally. It was the sequence of it, and that it was going to happen, and that we would have deflation before we had inflation and before we had hyperinflation. And remembering hyperinflation is a currency event, okay, as opposed to just inflation. And so we felt that the initial wave, and that's what we believe we're now entering into, is that we would see a deflation scare or real deflation. And we're clearly seeing it in commodities, as I mentioned earlier. We're seeing it in the energy complex. We're actually seeing quite broad-based. The problem with that is all of that, and you've written about it extensively, the financialization and the leverage that's been put into this and the rehypothecation. If this real deflation goes very far, we'll have an implosion of collateral. So it's our opinion that it can't go very deep before the central banks will be forced to do two things: guarantee some of the broken collateral, like it did it during the home crisis, 2008, where we guaranteed mortgages and et cetera. We came in to protect the collateral base. And secondly, to start accelerating the money print or the credit, to expand the credit supply, which creates what we refer to as the MPOP here. And that's the sequence that we think is unfolding. And we can see this pattern. We've seen this pattern we refer to as a megaphone pattern. We've seen it many, many times at most major crises, most major inflection points, going all the way back here to, in this slide, back to the 1920s.
And so as you have a chart here, Gordon, that shows that the megaphone pattern top is exactly what played out in 2014.
Exactly. And,
so it's, yeah.
And we're kind of now, we felt that it would finish the year because a lot of the money wanted to finish the year on a positive books. Now they're repositioning portfolios. So it was nothing was going to happen until we got right till January the 1st. We had a Bradley turn number on the 26th, which said that somewhere in there it's going to operate. In fact, it did start to happen on the 26th. But it's a repositioning that will go through here in the first quarter. And unless we react to this oil crisis, this energy shock is incredibly serious. And we had to do a show on this, you and I, Charles, right away when it first started to happen.
Right.
But if we just let it run its course, the wheels could come off. I don't believe for a moment powers to be will allow that. And so that's why I think this real deflation won't be allowed to run its course. And by run its course, I mean where we actually get repricing. Because the problem is we have mispricing of risk, we have lack of price discovery, and we have so much malinvestment. And you and I did a show, I guess 3 years ago, Charles, where we talked about the cycle requiring times where you go down and you get those things readjusted. And we can't allow it to happen because things will break so badly.
Right. And so why don't you lead us through your view that is going to require the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond to fall below 1%.
Yeah, I do. We've talked about that here many, many times. And well, think of it this way: when you make money when you print so much money and it's worthless, why should you get a lot of interest on that money? You're making it worthless. So shouldn't interest rates fall? But what we have in this convoluted paper bond market is that when interest rates fall, bond prices go up. Well, everybody wants the prices of the bond going up if interest rates are dropping. But at some point, what's that paper really worth? And that's what the whole dichotomy of risk falls into this, and the fool's game. But globally, right now, the 10-year bond is now at 10%. Germany is below 10 or 1% rather, 1% handle. The United States is the highest. We're up just over. Well, we just broke 2% here yesterday. So, but I believe we're on our way to 1%, and we have to take it there, Charles. The United States. We've got, and you guys talked. We have 75 million baby boomers retiring at 10,000 a day. $84 trillion of unfunded liability. $8 trillion is now in our current debt. Well, how are we going to pay that $84 trillion? It's like it's a giant Ponzi scheme, and you've written about it extensively. That's due, and it's a clock that's ticking. So that interest rates going up doesn't compute to trying to finance that kind of money. But it's worse than that, Charles. We've got 10 trillion of unfunded pensions right now, underfunded pensions right now. 4.7 at the state, 3 trillion at the federal, and nearly $1 trillion in corporate. You can't let these assets fall down. So the way to do it is, as they're doing in Japan, where the Japanese pension plan, the biggest pension plan in the world, is buying stocks, is actually selling bonds so that the government's buying them all, driving the yield right down, but holding it basically monetized as they buy stocks to drive equity prices up. We'll do the same. It's my opinion. And so the whole gig says we got to go to 1%. I know I'm alone on this, Charles. Everybody says interest rates are going up. I'm not in that camp. It's going down.
Well, Gordon, you've been prescient, and you and your guests have been prescient for years. I mean, you and I talked about the dollar soaring, I think in 2012, and it did take 2 years to play out, and now it's rising in a parabolic curve. And as you say, the destruction it's wreaking in other emerging markets is just phenomenal. But so I
So
have,
Charles, we called it the echo boom 2 years ago with all this hot money because we said like a boomerang, it'll come back and hit everybody in the back of the neck, and that's what's happening right now. And it goes back. It wasn't that they were making bad loans in the emerging markets. They were trying to fill what was perceived as supply. When you get mispricing of risk, you get malinvestment. You start investing on what you think demand is, but demand is not there. And so now they're overextended in capacity. Look at China right now. China's got so much capacity and they don't have the demand. They're not even worried about growth right now, Charles. They're worried about the number of jobs that they can produce. 10 million new jobs a year. That's the goal. That's what they have to produce. That's net. Never mind productivity taking it down. You want to know what a chin-up is. I don't know. China has got a massive chin-up in front of it to maintain the working population working.
Right, right. And I think that brings up a good point, which is what we're talking about here is not just monetary policy, but the effects of globalization. And so as China will probably have to revalue the yuan against the dollar, because as the dollar soars, so does the Chinese currency, the renminbi. So they're getting crushed as well by the dollar rising. So how do they get their 10 million jobs? Well, they'll have to delink that or lower their currency and basically export deflation to us. And that's, it's interesting, Gordon, that each central bank is responsible for their own little, fiefdom. The U.S. has a Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan and so on. But as you said, the money flows globally. So it throws a monkey wrench in all the monetary planning because the money flows wherever it'll get a return. And that leads to massive malinvestment and extraordinary risk. And the other thing that they don't think about is the effects of technology. Where does this money go? And the massive deflationary consequences of technology. That's not even in the playbook of the central banks, which is partly why they're failing.
Yeah, very, very valid point. Nobody's a bigger believer in technology than you and I spent most of my career in computer communications. But we have, I'll talk about it here. I live in Boston, Charles. When I came here, DEC had 400,000 employees. Data General had 100,000. Wang had 150,000. I can just keep on going. They're all gone. Done.
Yeah.
They've all moved. And how many have left? Well, we've been replaced with biotech here in the area, and I can name the big biotechs, but they all have 6,000 or 7,000 people. The technology has made us so much more productive, but now where are those hundreds of thousands of people finding work? This is around the globe. We have destructive constructive destruction going on right now in the world from technology. And as good as it is, but you've got to come up with the new investment for the new employment, and that's what we failed to do. Because we're not taking the kind of risks that it would take to employ hundreds of thousands of people. And that's the size of the magnitude of the problem. World Bank says we need 600 million new jobs in the next 10 years for the new advancing labor force. That's net.
Yeah.
So we have a productivity paradox. As good as it is, it's stripping out creative destruction. It's stripping out jobs at a faster rate than we're investing to create new jobs. And there's a demand problem, right? Overcapacity, a problem again.
And what we're really saying is printing money and lowering interest rates doesn't fix that problem. It simply creates sources of instability. And now we're reaping the consequences of that.
But point I'll mention before we break, Charles, is don't worry, the government will print the money. So this is going to go on for a while. It's going to get more and more instability, more and more frightening moments in it. until we realize that it's not working. And then we start to panic out of the currency, because then we decide that the currency is the problem and we have a fiat currency crisis. But right now, the least ugly house on the street is the American dollar, which happens to be the biggest problem. But this game could go on for a while. Anyway, I've talked too much here in this show, but it's been a great discussion. Any closing comments you'd like to make, Charles?
No, I just think that the topic of deflation and the frantic push by central banks to create inflation is the story of the year, and that's what we'll be following. And I hope we've revealed some of the complexity of this topic. It's actually touches on globalization, geopolitics, currencies, technology, jobs. It's all related, and I hope we'll continue to elucidate all that complexity.
Charles, all the best, and I'll talk to you again next month.
Okay, thank you, Gordon.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.